love letter to all the good men. Eyes only opened when you bore witness to the actions whipping us, to fathers and daughters who on us pour their inflicted pain. A love like faint sunshine that cracks through dull showers in breaks of rain. And we take the gains from the empty sorries, and we lap them up, eyes blotched and blurred from their fired words, when a match lights paper and it all burns, scorched, fanning out. But not you. You see us for all we are, whole and real, like the Sundance on walls in morning, peace and quiet. People, after all, like you, all value added just by knowing us. You are the real deal of men, whose hands raise ours when we reach the mountaintop, together, higher than ever. For surely we must know, Níneart go cúrla céile, there's no strength without unity. Your love, given freely, no returns policy, never any punity, never a return to sender. Kiss, kiss, kiss. When we believe survivors of abuse, when we educate young people early, and when we act together, we can help to create a much safer society for everyone. I want to share with you this bookmark. It's so simple. One side loves me, the other side loves me not. Had I been handed this bookmark when I was at school, in a health class or any class, things could have been immeasurably different for me and my mother, my sisters. Firstly, I'd have instantly been able to recognise what a healthy relationship looks like and what an unhealthy relationship looks like. Secondly, that could have prevented a lot of pain, potentially. And thirdly, I imagine I would have taken that bookmark home, placed it on the kitchen counter, and it could have opened up some conversations with me and my mum and my sisters. And maybe things would have changed, maybe things wouldn't have changed. But one thing I know in that moment is that we'd have recognised that we weren't crazy, that it wasn't our fault, that we would be believed, and there was support. Approximately 840 million women, that's 1 in 3, age 15 and over, have experienced physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence or sexual non-partner violence in their lifetime. And that prevalence hasn't really changed much in the last 20 years, unfortunately. In fact, the statistics are likely much higher because women and girls don't tend to report. And they often don't report for many reasons, but one of the reasons is fear. Fear that they won't be believed, fear that they'll be blamed, fear of the perpetrator. And we all deserve safety. We all deserve to feel safe, but we also deserve to feel safe and believed when we share our stories. And if a survivor of abuse ever chooses you to share their story with, your response in that moment is so powerful, whether you know it or not, because your response can actually help to shape the healing journey of that person and even their capacity to heal. It can influence whether stigmas are perpetuated or broken, and it can even influence whether that person ever chooses to speak out again and seek support. And I know you might be thinking, Danielle, of course we would react with empathy and compassion. But unfortunately, that is not the lived experience of many women and girls. And I know, because of my own lived experience, having gone through domestic abuse as a child growing up, and because I have listened to so many women and girls share their stories. And sometimes a response, even though it's not intended to be cruel, can look something like this. Why'd you stay then? Why'd you stay so long? And he was always so nice to me, though. And was it really that bad? And didn't he pay for your university degree? And so, when a survivor is met with that kind of response, all it tends to do, really, is gaslight the survivor all over again and make them question their reality all over again. So what I ask from each and every one of you is your allyship, so that we can begin to create this culture shift together. So, how did I become this accidental activist and poet? Well, let me take you back 5 or 6 years ago, because there was a couple of things happening in the world that I really just couldn't ignore any longer. And one of those things was the school regulator, the UK school regulator, known as Ofsted, in 2021 reported on the prevalence of sexual harassment and online sexual abuse in schools and colleges. And it found a number of very concerning findings, but one of the main concerns was that the young people thought the incidents were so commonplace that they didn't even think there was point in reporting. For example, 79% of girls said sexual assault happens a lot or sometimes. And when the reviewers asked the girls why they hadn't reported, they said, "We were worried about how the adults would react, that we wouldn't be believed, and that we'd be blamed, and that once we told an adult, the process would be out of their control." So that happened. Then, in March 2021, Sarah Everard is attacked and murdered by a serving Metropolitan Police officer. And this sparks national outcry, anger, and grief. And then a year later, Aisling Murphy is attacked and murdered. And this time it's closer to home and closer to the bone, maybe because this was only a few towns away from where I grew up. And she was 23, so about the same age that my sister was at the time. And she was Irish, and she was a teacher. And she'd just finished teaching her primary school lessons that day and had headed out for her routine run. And vigils were set up in many places. And I remember heading into school sort of that week. I guess this was sort of a big catalyst, all of this happening. And I remember heading into school. I'm a teacher for the past 16 years, and I work with young women and girls every day. And I remember going into school and talking to my students. And I said to them, "What is going on in the world?" And they said, "Miss, it's an epidemic. We can't even exist anymore." And I thought, "What do you want to do?" And they said, "Miss, we have to do something. What can we do?" And I said, "Well, there are vigils happening in lots of different places. We could do a vigil." Now, look, I'd never done a vigil. I had no roadmap of a vigil or how to do a school movement. But we did it together. And they were fed up. They'd had enough. At 11, 15, 17, telling me that they'd heard sexist names on the soccer pitch, told to get back to the kitchen, what they'd experienced online, being followed home by men in their uniforms, intimidated on public transport. They'd had enough. And so we organised a vigil. And we got the green light from our school leaders. The culture was right. And on a very cold, crisp January afternoon, the sun was shining. We all stood out on our school terrace, 700 of us. Men, women, students. We invited the boys from the boys' college across the road. And we all stood in solidarity together. And they lit candles, and they read poetry, and they played their instruments, and we raised the Irish flag. But it wasn't just about Aisling. It was about every single woman and girl who had experienced violence. And we were all standing together in solidarity. And so, a couple of months later, a task force is set up in Jersey to look into violence against women and girls. And I'm invited onto that task force. And we send public surveys out into the community. One is an adult survey, and one is a young person survey from 11 to 25. And some of my students helped craft the young people's survey questions. And in the end, over 1,800 young people took part in that survey. And then it released its findings in November 2023. And it gave 77 recommendations to the Government of Jersey and other sectors. And it found that 97% of women, so nearly all women that took the survey, had experienced sexual harassment. And more than half of the girls surveyed, 11 to 25, had experienced at least one form of violence. And then there was also this link made, this correlation, that actually the older you get as a girl, the more likely you are to experience violence against women and girls. And so now we had data, and now we had testimonies. And in the meantime, I continue the work in school. And I begin to develop these leadership, student activism platforms. And I do this by reaching out to the students. And I say to them, I'm going to start a violence against women and girls group so that we work to end it. If you want to take part, write back and tell me why. And they did. And in the last 2 years, they have delivered talks to their peers, from healthy relationships, to sexism, to misogyny, to red flags, to online sexual deepfakes. They have worked with government campaigns to end street harassment. They have written for their local newspaper, A Day in the Life of a 17-year-old Girl. They have fundraised, and they've led events across the school. And I thought, well, wow, I'm so proud of them. And then I think, well, this is all really well and good. But what about all the other children in all the other schools? And so I go back to my task force. Some of them are teachers, the members. And I say to them, well, you're doing great work over here, and we're doing great work over there. But how do we make this consistent across all schools? How do we help all schools? And so then we create guidance. We create a toolkit, a pathway, a way to start for schools to help them identify and prevent and eradicate violence against women and girls. Because one of the recommendations for education, you know those 77 recommendations? Well, one of them for education was a whole school approach to end violence against women and girls. And I think, well, this is great. We have a toolkit now. But then I thought, well, what if that toolkit just sort of sits there gathering dust and nobody really looks at it because it's not a priority? Because schools have a lot of priorities. And so then I go back to my task force and I say to them, right, how are we going to make this a priority? What are we going to do? Because we need structural change. We need it to be a priority. We need it in framework. We need it as a policy. And then we changed how schools are reviewed and inspected. And from September 2025, all schools, primary and secondary, are now expected to show how they are working to end violence against women and girls in their setting. Now that's impact. That's change. That's collective action. Steps together. It's structural. Then, at a societal level, there's more change. Remember those 77 recommendations? Well, the criminal justice system has also acted on those recommendations. And they've made changes to laws. They've strengthened old ones and brought in new ones. From stalking, to non-fatal strangulation, to domestic abuse, to online harms including deepfakes, and to threats of violence and harassment. And now we have this collective action together, steps together. And so when I think back really to what the catalyst was, Maybe it was that I wished there was a teacher doing this work then, back when I was at school. And I also think back to 5 or 6 years ago. I couldn't have written that poem 5 or 6 years ago. I wouldn't have had the confidence. And I also wouldn't have had the language to even articulate that domestic abuse applied to my situation. I hadn't been handed the bookmark then, and I hadn't started the journey. So, when a person tells you that they are or were not safe, believe them. When young people ask for change, listen. And when you wonder what one person can do, take those first small steps together. Because Níneart go Cúirle Céile, there is no strength without unity. Thank you.